My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm here today with Nick Consonery, who's a director at the Rhodium Group, which is a research firm focusing on global macro trends. Previously, who worked at FTI Consulting, and full disclosure, sat next to me for 2 years back at the Eurasia Group. Today, we're going to be talking about his recent China dashboard, which looks at the developments of various policy reform efforts that the Xi government has been pushing. And he has a pretty negative outlook on what's been going down on the reform side. So looking forward to jumping in on that with you. Nick, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk.
Well, thank you for having me, Jordan. This is really great, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to share some of our views with you.
Great. So Nick, why China?
Well, I think, honestly, for me, maybe similar to your experience in China right now, Jordan, but my passion for the country really sort of started with the study of the language. Freshman year, fall term, I went to college in small school in South Carolina, and then I had a language requirement, and I decided to start studying Chinese. And that was in the fall of 2001, not to date myself too much, but sort of one thing led to another. I had an opportunity to study abroad in Shanghai in 2002 and interned with a venture capital fund at the Port Free Trade Zone in Tianjin in 2004, and ended up going to graduate school to study Chinese politics and get a master's degree in Asian studies. And the rest is history, I guess.
So what has kept you interested in the country?
Well, the story's been so vibrant over the past 10 years, right? I mean, when I came out of graduate school and, I had an opportunity to be hired at the Eurasia Group, and, we were focusing on obviously politics, policy, political risk, country risk. And China was the primary focus of a lot of client private sector and public sector interest in that market. And so it was very apparent, and it remains apparent throughout my career that demand for real insight into what's going on in China, what has recently happened in China, and demand for good analysis of what we think is coming is very high. So it's I think it's just been I've benefited from the growth that China has seen, and more than that, maybe because I don't think it's just the headline economic growth, but it's the underlying dynamics that drive that growth. What's really going on in the economy, what's going on in the economy and what's going on in the policy realm tell us about the sustainability or lack thereof of this economic model, and what will be the reverberations of various scenarios in that regard. So obviously the financial crisis sort of accelerated that. China's role as the incremental predominant driver of global economic growth put it in the sort of forefront of the market focus and the corporate focus. And now here we are fast forwarding to today, and maybe this is a great segue to the China dashboard product, but it's in an environment where China's obviously been successful in sustaining at the surface apparently rapid economic growth. But there are swirling questions about at what cost and, what types of downside risks may be on the horizon. So it's, our dashboard product is really an effort to try to grapple with that, to say, hey, what's working, what isn't, look at the observable data and try to understand what's changed, what hasn't, and what more the government needs to do.
Well, Nick, I really appreciate you doing my job for me. The China Dashboard Project, a new research report, which is more than a research report, that came out a few weeks ago now, walks through a number of different policy lenses, looking at what the Chinese government is and isn't doing. So could you walk us through why you think the world needed this and what it encompasses?
Yeah, so look, I think first and foremost that the dashboard is a collaborative product between the Rhodium Group and our partners at the Asia Society Policy Institute, which have an important role to play in charting the course for our research and providing analytic feedback and helping to promote the product and obviously hosting it on their website. So we're, this is very much a collaborative product between the two of our institutions. And I think it was really born out of this idea fundamentally that, there's a broad sense in the China observer community and the broader sort of market investor community and among policymakers around the world that there's a substantial set of policy challenges, economic reform policy challenges, that the Chinese government is currently facing. Board product was basically to try to really look at the data, look at all the available indicators that we can either base on existing data streams coming from China or from global sources, or do through the process of our own observations of realities on the ground to try to basically put some real rigor around understanding what's going on, and then produce some analysis based on that in regard to what's working, what isn't.
Great. So before we start jumping into the specific policy regions, could you talk a little bit about what Xi's main goals are? Could you summarize, where you think his head at is in regards to overall strategy? In the piece, you mentioned that in July of 2017, the National Work Conference said that the root of many of China's greatest risks was too much leveraged debt flowing through SOE and local government balance sheets, and that dealing with this problem was the nation's top priority. But that conviction seems to have not played out necessarily over the subsequent 6 months. So where do you think his head's at now?
Look, I think the Xi administration's focus right now is predominantly on trying to follow through with the, somewhat focused, I would say, set of economic policy priorities they've identified over the past few years. You mentioned one of those, which is the deleveraging campaign, which is about fundamentally, it's about trying to reduce financial systemic risk and limit malpractice in the financial and financial services sector. That's obviously been a major focus of policy over the past year. And one, by the way, that we think is having a tangible effect on the financial sector and on capital markets in China. And I certainly see that in my work day to day, working with financial institutions who are trying to understand how they may be affected by this policy shift, or really seeing those realities play out in the market. And in addition to that, and I think somewhat related to it, you've got this, what they call the supply side structural reform agenda, which is about trying to reduce production overcapacities in heavy industries. And that pertains to a number of the indicators that we observe in our dashboard: environment, innovation, investment, obviously competition, state-owned enterprises. I mean, the supply side structural reform agenda touches on so many elements of China's overall industrial policy. It has tangible price effects, which we see promoting or boosting in some ways artificially the performance and profits of state-owned companies and industries that have been the focus of supply-side efforts. So, to take a step back, though, I think what we see is a government that has to give fair credit, has identified, some areas where structural adjustments are needed, or where risks are becoming so severe that policy needed to turn, and they're focused on trying to, at the margins, make some improvements there. The concern is this sort of broader story about China headed in a more market-based, less state interventionist and state-run direction, which was this whole idea of, a converging China that was the basis for, the United States and other countries to support China's accession to the World Trade Organization and to engage, on a collaborative basis with China over the past 2 decades. Maybe, I guess at the minimum we could say is not being fully implemented in our dashboard. Process really and results speaks to how much farther the government has to go. So that's a concern when you ask about what is the government, what's the administration, what is the president, focused on, and what are they not? Again, it seems to be about addressing sort of what's right in front, these kind of immediate risks and changes that need to be made, but not necessarily addressing the longer term structural reform issues.
I'd like you to play devil's advocate for me. So one of the sentences you write in this piece was that we did not expect to hear China's economists argue, as we hear them saying now, that the policy package China intended was never market-oriented in the manner the term is used in OECD countries, and that different and non-convergent economic models are the new order. So, if you don't actually buy into the liberalizing reform strategy that the whole China dashboard is predicated on. What's the argument in terms of disregarding these sorts of reforms?
Well, I mean, I think there are two. I think the first is that these aren't just our or global or Western or IMF or World Bank recommendations, right? These are we're evaluating as Premier Li Keqiang. We quote this in the text of our dashboard that when the Chinese government in 2013 announced this substantial agenda of economic reform, which included all these elements, right? Labor reform, addressing fiscal reform and the problems in the fiscal regime, more open capital markets, a fairer, more competitive environment. All these indicators are policy priorities that the Chinese government itself has committed to following through with. So I think it's important from an observer's perspective. And this is what I was going to say is that Premier Li Keqiang, when these reforms were announced, actually said directly that the Chinese government invited outside observers to score China on its progress and to evaluate how China was really doing and carrying through with these priorities. So we take Premier Li at his word that the Chinese officialdom would like to see a fair assessment, and this is an honest effort to try to develop something like that. So that's the first point. And the second is that, look, this is, we fundamentally believe that, a failure to follow through with many of these needed structural adjustments, particularly in areas like the financial sector, the fiscal regime, is going to significantly accelerate downside risks to China at the minimum, I think resulting in, and certainly raising our concern that China could enter a period of much slower economic growth. And from a big picture perspective, I think the view is that the longer these kinds of reforms are delayed, the more to which that just erodes future growth potential. So that's the second, I think, really important point here, is that this is very much based on the idea that there is a right set of policy responses. And we can identify some of those, and that Beijing has already done a great job of identifying some of those. And so, we need to understand now if they're really being carried out.
But the fundamental re-questioning of those policy responses that was laid out by Premier Li a few years ago, is that a movement that you think is gaining steam, or is the kind of backsliding on these policies more about the difficulties of implementation?
I think I honestly think that's a little bit of an unknowable question. I think we can identify many obstacles to implementation in each reform category. But what I would say is that, if you look at environmental policy, for example, which is one of the areas where, we give the government good credit for making some, in some areas we think relatively significant progress, and particularly in addressing air pollution in major cities. There are a lot of reasons that the government faced pushback and entrenched interests and obstacles to reform implementation. But nonetheless, it was such an important priority that the government has been able to make some significant progress. So I don't think this is just about impediments. I don't think it's just about entrenched interests. I think it's about political priorities and policymaking capacity. And what we hope is that the government finds the bandwidth and the space to prioritize some of these other bigger issues relatively soon.
Great. So after that overview, let's go down the list and talk about some of these policy areas in particular. And let's start with the good. So you just mentioned the environment. Could you walk through some of the data inputs you chose for that, and why you think the air quality and such has really shown a positive trajectory over the past year?
Yeah. So on the environmental cluster, basically we have a number of different indicators. The primary one is a gauge of China's air and water quality, where on that we basically look to available public data. For the air pollution, we actually look at PM 2.5 data from U.S. embassies and consulates in Shenyang, Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, and Guangzhou. So basically we pull that data directly from that source. We impose some seasonal effects to try to mitigate, basically the seasonality around the winter seasons in particular, and come up with an aggregate sort of measurement of, how things are changing over time. And that's the area where, again, we do see that there's been some noteworthy improvement. On the water quality index, we actually look directly to data provided by the Ministry of Environmental Protection, and regarding water quality in some of the, China's biggest river basins. That data is actually published monthly. So on that front, we have some, directly provided government indicators that feed into the analysis.
So in general, for the data we're going to end up talking about, people have questions about Chinese data. So to what extent do you think, these imports are trustworthy? How have you tried to discount the effects of state officials trying to fudge certain numbers? I mean, every week now it seems we're having a new province revise its past GDP data. So could you talk about the weighing data process that you've had to go through for this exercise of looking at all these different policy areas?
So I think, there are two big picture kind of answers to this. The first is that, remember, the dashboard it's not just reliant on sort of one or two different data streams, right? For each of the reform clusters that we look at, and there are 10 of those, we've developed 5 to 6 different primary and supplemental indicators that, really aggregate, in our view, the best available information out there on each of those different clusters. And again, imposes some methodology. Each one is different. It could be a 4-quarter moving average to smooth seasonal effects. It could be, estimating certain industrial production or industrial value added data when it's not available because it hasn't been released by the Chinese government. But we have, corollaries in similar economies or in similar sectors in China that we can make some estimates around. But the big sort of number one overall story is that this is really about an aggregation of many, many points of data, not one in particular. And so to the greatest extent possible, what we try to do and what we have to do as analysts is to develop an approach that, takes into account available information from the Chinese government, but also supplements that with any other information we can find, and in areas where appropriate, discounts data that we may feel is inaccurate based on that. So and that's really the second point, is that the whole argument of dashboard is that this is about doing exactly this process of looking at all the available data, looking at what we really know about how global markets are changing, about how demand patterns are changing, about how capital, and financial flows are changing within China and globally, and trying to make some assessments about, whether reform is being implemented or not. So, it's a very comprehensive effort, and to the greatest extent possible, we took into account in developing the methodology that you really can't obviously rely on every single piece of official data singularly, but collectively, I think the fabric knitted together tells a very accurate tale.
Well, I'm glad there's still room for qualitative analysts like yourself, because last time I remember, I'm not sure you were able to do seasonal spreading or what have you by yourself, but it seems like you've got a great team behind you to help you with the numbers, and given China's policy environment today, there's still a lot needed on the qualitative side. So, turning next to our other positive policy realm, innovation.
So the innovative indicator is actually I think it's really fascinating because, and like you said, Jordan, this is, one of the other two areas where we, give the Chinese government some credit. And actually the innovative indicator is the one where we show the most forward progress. And what this indicator really looks like, the primary analysis is based on the contribution of innovative industries to industrial value added in the economy. And so we evaluate sort of what role innovative industries are playing in driving economic growth in China, and how that's changed over time. But then we also compare that to a benchmark of 2011 to 2014 OECD averages in developed markets like the US, EU, and Japan. And it's really fascinating because what the findings show basically are that, China's innovative industries contribution to industrial value add is, as of the third quarter of last year, is around 32% today. The U.S. In the OECD average from 2011 to 2014 is 33.6%. So, in other words, what the finding shows is that China is, we expect, going to catch up to the U.S. contribution of innovative industries to the industrial structure within the year. So that's actually a big headline finding, and it's driven by two main sources on the China front. The first is that obviously with the government's aggressive and very robust R&D and innovation programs in areas like artificial intelligence and electric vehicles, and I'm sure your listeners are going to be familiar with the broad set of innovative industries that the Chinese government is promoting right now. So that's having material success and driving up the share of innovative industries and growth overall in China. And the second reason, which I think is also really interesting and is related to an earlier point that we made, is that supply side structural reform, which is taking off production over capacities and heavy, inefficient industries, is actually reducing the share of those traditional industries to the industrial structure. So we see both effects playing out in the data. First, that that innovative industries are becoming more important, but also at the same time that the traditional industries are becoming less important. So that's driven this improvement in the innovative assessment, which seems to be a big success for China.
So two follow-ups to this this finding. So first of all, we out of our 7 or 8 indices, these two are the only ones that are moving in a positive direction. Do you think that's because these are relatively low-hanging fruit? Have these been prioritized more? What gives?
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, and I think, and like you alluded to, Jordan, I mean, I guess we probably tend to view our starting perspective, you and I, maybe through more of a policy and political capacity lens. And, on that, I really think these have been the biggest political priorities. I really do. I think the environmental crisis in China has been a major point of concern, obviously for the many Chinese citizens who are affected by that on a day-to-day basis. And that has feeded directly into the policymaking process and meant that the government really had no choice but to take this more seriously. And on the innovation front, I think, probably a little bit more towards what you said. Is it easier? I mean, I don't think supply side structural reform was easy. I don't think, forcing mandatory shutdowns and factory closures, which had a, tremendously negative effect on growth and across China's industrial heartland in the Northeast, was easy at all. I mean, that came with real, downside political costs, but the innovative piece of it, the R&D funding piece of it, obviously that industrial policy is something that the Chinese government has, successfully used to promote growth and investment for a long time. So again, I think there's a huge priority to create jobs, and there's a recognition in the Chinese government that the future industrial structure is going to have to be much more about high technology and innovative industries. And so, that's been the result.
Could you talk about some central contradictions in this reform agenda? So maybe are there any sort of reforms that are at cross purposes? So maybe in pushing the innovation agenda, it makes reform on trade and investment harder because we want to keep up barriers so that Tesla can't just take over the Chinese electric vehicle market. So we have time for our domestic companies to grow, that sort of thing. Are there lots of crosswinds at play on this reform agenda?
Yeah, I think that's a very insightful point, Jordan. And I think, the piece of it that is about industrial policy and is about, state-led economic and business outcomes is absolutely, in some inherent sense, contradictory to many of the other initiatives on the agenda, right? I mean, financial sector liberalization is about liberalizing capital and reducing the state's, outsized role in determining where capital flows. And reducing the inefficiencies inherent to the current system. many of which gravitate around subsidized funding to state-owned companies, which are the biggest holders of outstanding debt in China today and are a major concern for financial systemic risk. So yeah, that's a big juxtaposition that the government is needing to grapple with. Competition too, I think, is another piece of this, right? Our competition indicator actually, we showed some backsliding in this edition from the last. We saw that, for example, foreign mergers involving foreign companies were significantly more likely, I think 4 times more likely, to come under review from China's anti-monopoly regulators than mergers between domestic firms, which was a big increase from the previous quarter. And things like judicial transparency, intellectual property protection, while an outward focus of policymakers, and we recognize in the third quarter there's, on the intellectual property front in particular, been a flurry of new activity. The reality is, China still has a very, very long way to go, and Chinese leaders openly recognize that as well. So, how do you square, very robust and assertive state support for innovative industries with, having a meaningful set of protections for intellectual property and a competitive environment that allows foreign firms and domestic firms to compete on a level playing field? Is that even possible in China today? Those are big questions.
Well, we're looking forward to seeing the Chinese government struggle with them. So going down to another one of the backsliding policy reforms, you previously mentioned competition, but another one I want to turn to, which there's been some recent news about, is on fiscal policy. So what's been going on there? Yeah, so
unfortunately, our fiscal indicators are relatively bleak, right? I mean, we basically look at official government, local government budgets, and then we look at augmented local government budgets, which includes things like infrastructure financing and land transfer fees. And we try to come up with a more realistic assessment of what really is the gap between what local governments are asked to spend and the revenue that they bring in, as a gauge of, where is this whole conversation about China's fiscal, assumed to be relatively bleak fiscal picture actually headed. And, what our indicator shows is that just a massive...
Sorry, so by bleak fiscal picture, you mean everyone's in debt?
Right. Well, what I mean specifically is that local governments are asked to spend significantly more than the revenue that they're bringing in through official or semi-official channels. So our assessment shows that, the gap between overall spending and revenue as a ratio is around 144% at the local government level as of the third quarter of last year, which in other words means that local governments are spending about 44% more than the revenue that they bring in, which obviously...
How does that work?
Yeah.
Hello?
Well, you mean like how do they...
Yeah. So like how can they spend that money? What's the... Just lay it out for ignorant listeners, including myself here.
Well, so, I mean, basically the local governments are going into increasing amounts of debt, right, to finance activities. I mean, that's basically the concern here, is that this is a accelerating factor for the fiscal indebtedness picture that raises a whole broader set of concerns about economic sustainability for China across the board. So, the question really is, and you mentioned, I think, Jordan, that there's been some recent interesting policy activity on this front. Remember, China's fiscal regime is born out of a process where basically the central government, in an effort dating back to the 90s, wanted to have a stronger ability to shape fiscal realities at the provincial level. Obviously, China has a long history of, very powerful sort of provincial level, government structures, and the central government felt like they wanted to be able to control that to a greater degree. And so now local governments are really dependent on what they call transfer payments from the central government to make up their spending gaps, basically. So they spend a certain amount, like you mentioned. How do they pay for it? A big piece of that is that they're fundamentally reliant on the central government coming in and transferring significant amounts of money to the local governments to basically offset the funding gaps that they have. And the system is not sustainable. It's become increasingly difficult for provincial governments to satisfy the obligations that they have on their books. And there's a broad sense that as the demographics continue to evolve in a way that is going to require more spending on social welfare and all of its various facets, that these burdens are just going to become unmanageable. So we think fiscal reform is one of the most fundamental and necessary pieces of the overall kind of reform package or reform agenda that we've identified. And again, it's an area where we just don't see that we don't see that many of the needed changes are actually happening. So this last week there was an announcement that there may be some changes to how local governments are able to basically send through costs to the central government for things like social welfare spending. But to be determined if this is really going to change the outlook here.
Let's turn now to some of the international economic indicators. So trade and investment, you say are both sort of sitting in neutral right now. I'm curious what impact, if any, Trump kicking off a tit for tat tariff war would have, not just on those two indicators, but whether or not this could spill over into the other policy arenas and make reform more difficult on more domestic focused reforms.
Right. Well, first of all, I hope you're right that what we really get from well, we'll see. I mean, we'll see. I guess I would say it's an optimistic view to say that all we'll see from the Trump administration is a tit for tat set of policy responses. I think there's scenarios where we see a much more comprehensive and assertive response from the Trump administration. And I actually really think that, right now the sort of not just China economic observers, but I think markets generally and companies generally are really, maybe companies less so, but I think there's a strong underestimation of the willingness of the Trump team to really pursue some very aggressive policies this year. So I think you're right to identify this. I think it's a major risk, and it's going to speak to, first at a sort of an existential level, right? I mean, this whole idea, we talked earlier about convergence and, is there still an argument to be made on the US's part toward China or with China that, a lot of these sort of market-oriented reforms are in its best longer-term interests. And, obviously there's a sense that the United States needs to have at least a stable set of relations with China to be able to make that argument. And, I think we're entering a sort of new world where there's a lot of introspection and dismissiveness in Washington about whether China is ever going to get back on this trajectory. And as a result of that, there's this willingness to pull these levers that haven't been pulled before or haven't been pulled for a very long time. So yes, I absolutely think, I think it's probably less in the immediate sense, our balance of payments indicators that speak to the investment flows. We moved that into neutral sort of territory this year, which was this quarter, which was really about, the Chinese government having successfully stabilized capital outflows after a round of, significant pressure in that area previously. But, we really didn't see any fundamental opening in China's capital markets or financial markets. And, if the global environment changes in such a way that precipitates more capital outflows, and becomes a bigger problem for China, we may move that back in the other direction next quarter. So I don't think we saw too much, fundamental reform there, and neither on the trade front. I think that's probably where the Trump action speaks most directly, right? We look at China's imports of highly protected products and see really no material changes. And interestingly, though, I think, Jordan, when your initial question was sort of, it's assumed, I think it's definitely going to get harder, as the Trump administration moves forward with a sort of trade action to convince China to, further open up. And I would say there's an alternative scenario where, and there are some indications of it already. I mentioned earlier that the Chinese government has been talking more about intellectual property protections, which sort of really accelerated on the policy discussion agenda right as the Trump administration was talking about, a 301 case that would involve penalizing Chinese imports over intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers. And so there's some hints there that, the Chinese government may be thinking about ways to, try to address some of these concerns rather than just get into a tit for tat conflict. And also on the trade front, you may have seen, but last month there was an announcement that a number of previously protected consumer goods, we're going to see their imports reduced from the tariffs reduced from the China side, and there may be more to come there. So I'm not really willing to just say this all necessarily going to be all conflict and no potential upside for our indicators. I think that's going to rest on priorities and decision making both in China and in DC.
It's fascinating to think about the impact of Trump on creating a more optimistic Chinese policy scenario, right? We've had Xi go to Davos. We've had another Chinese leader whose name is escaping me over the past few months show up in Davos and say that we're going to surprise the world in how committed to these economic reforms. So maybe there's something to be said going back to the Chinese word for contradiction, like Mao Dun, right? Where it's actually made up of the two words for sword and shield. So maybe it's the sort of thing where America turning from the sword to the shield kind of necessitates or gives the opportunity for China to take up that mantle of global liberalism, which is a kind of crazy thing to hear coming out of my mouth. But there is a really fascinating tension here, isn't there?
Right. Yeah, and that was Liu He at Davos who made this commitment to further progress on the reform front. And what I would say about that, though, is I think, we're in an environment now where the promises are not enough. And what the global community wants to see, I think what policymakers in Washington want to see, and what, invested, observers like myself and our team at Rhodium Group who, have really believe that the sustainability of the economy over the longer term requires some of these reform efforts to really happen. That's what everyone wants to see, and so there's maybe some hope. There's definitely hope, that the Chinese government is going to get down to the business of following through with some of the stuff that they've said that they want to pursue. But the proof is going to be in the dashboard. The proof is going to be in the indicators, right? This is not just about the high level commitments anymore, but it's really about, do we see these things changing? Do we see judicial transparency improving? Do we see the competitive landscape for foreign firms improving? Do we see the financial sector becoming more sustainable, not less? These are observable, and the dashboard effort is an attempt to, provide that insight to policymakers in both places.
Well, looking forward to having you back every few months and talking through how this story evolves. Thanks so much, Nick. This was really great.
Thank you. Happy to. It's excellent.
Yo, I brought the studio shit. Do that shit to me like this. 你别再狡辩了，真的。
Yo, listen to me.
听不进去。
Listen to me,
别狡辩
baby.
了，说那么多有什么用呢？
I ain't tripping.
真的不想听呀。
Yeah, 我发誓我不是你看到的就这点出息，我霸占你们家的电视，怪我容易入戏，我变得没有礼貌，因为你说不用客气，我想的还有很多，不止和你翻云覆雨，跟来放慢你的步伐我不想跟你的关系复杂化，跟我到台北的北边度假吧，你笑的幅度不大，好像蒙娜丽莎，但这样好吗 ？Relax 好吗？我保证从今以后再也不去酒吧，我哪儿不好吗？求求你好吗？旁边有这么多人看，就跟我走吧。我喜欢看别的女孩，just 看一看而已。这闷热的天气让我荷尔蒙分泌，我想得到的话 ，it's so easy 不费力，在心里只装得下你，没人能对比。嘿，
狡辩，谁都听得出来，只是不想坦白，每个人都存在。狡辩，别说听不明白，看谁说的精彩，我等你的信赖。狡辩会讨人厌，我伤害到你，我道个歉，我不想狡辩，太可怜，请你不要视而不见。
Clap your hand like this, clap your hand like this, baby, clap your hand like this. Yeah, 我在想你，所以你会打喷嚏。You can be my Mona Lisa, I can be your 达芬奇。对我来说，年龄还有距离都不成问题。我的心加上你的名，变得更动听。Hey, oh, hey, oh， 融化你的冰川，先叫我热情似火。March way DZ, Tupac Biggie Small。
狡辩，谁 都听得出来，只是不想坦白，每个人都存在。小编，别说听不明白，看谁说的精彩，我等你的信赖。